For thousands of years, African Americans were captured, enslaved, and forced to obey their masters. Rosa Parks knew of the harsh treatment of African Americans from her grandfather, who was once a slave. All her life, she and her family were victims of racial segregation and discrimination, until December 1st, 1955, when she decided to take a stand. She was born on February 4th, 1913, in Tuskegee, Alabama. As a child, she was taught that everyone was born equal. Although she recalls having many white friends, racism was still difficult to ignore in her town. During that time period, African Americans and whites were separated due to the existence of Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws required the distinction of blacks in public places, such as schools, restaurants, and transportation.
Her and her family also faced many dangers concerning the Ku Klux Klan. She remembers her grandfather staying up at night with a shotgun ready to protect his family if the time came. On December 18, 1932, Rosa Louise McCauley married Raymond Parks. He was a major activist in the Scottsboro Boys' Trial, and along with Rosa worked in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This organization's purpose was to ensure economic, political, and social equality of all races. Although her contributions to this organization were greatly admired, she was about to alter the lives of several African Americans for centuries to come.
At the time, Montgomery's city code stated, "Every person operating a bus line in the city shall provide equal but separate accommodations for white people and Negroes on his buses." Along with African Americans' dislike of the present bus situation, they also requested a number of changes. This included representation on all boards affecting African Americans, better housing with adequate safety, better occupations with suitable wages, and better conditions of their communities. They persisted with their efforts to gain rights, but unfortunately no change occurred. Rosa Parks took a stand by sitting down.
Well, I was arrested on December 1st, 1955 for refusing to stand up on the orders of the bus driver after the white seats had been occupied in the front. And of course I was not in the front of the bus as many people have written and spoken that I got on the bus and took a front seat, but I did not. I took a seat that was just back of where the white people were sitting. And in fact, the last seat, and the man was next to the window, and I took an aisle seat, and there were two women across. And we went on undisturbed until about the second or third stop when some white people boarded the bus and left one man standing. And when the driver noticed him standing, he told us to stand up and let him have those seats. He referred to them as front seats. And when the other three people, after some hesitancy, stood up, he wanted to know if I was going to stand. I told him I was not, and he told me he would have me arrested. I told him he may do that. And of course he did.
As Ms. Parks explained, she was not sitting in the front of the bus. She was following the procedure and left enough room in the front of the bus for white people to sit. When there were no seats remaining, the bus driver demanded that Rosa Parks, along with 3 other African Americans, had to stand up to allow a white man to sit. The other 3 people obeyed, but Ms. Parks refused to give up her seat.
She was well aware of the consequences of her actions and did not regret her decision. Rosa Parks was of course arrested for her disobedience to the segregation laws. She was tired of being treated unfairly because of the color of her skin.
As I look back on those days, it's just like a dream, and the only thing that bothered me was that we waited so long to make this protest and to let it be known wherever we go that all of us should be free and equal and have all opportunities that others should have.
Rosa Parks did not know that she sparked the revolution for African Americans' racial equality. Her courageous actions inspired others to stand up for their constitutional rights. Throughout Alabama, African Americans refused to ride the bus, thus forming the Montgomery bus boycott.
The Montgomery bus boycott began on December 5, 1955, the day of Rosa Parks' trial. Both the Montgomery Improvement Association and the National Advancement of Colored People aided the boycott and forced the city bus system to pay attention to the former customers. One of the most prominent civil rights leaders was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who led about 90% of the black population to refuse taking the bus.
African Americans did everything in their power to end segregation on buses. They even bought cars and station wagons to prevent people from riding the bus. By boycotting, African Americans were able to put the Montgomery, Alabama buses out of business. By having less customers and making less money, the buses had no choice but to shut down.
During the Montgomery bus boycott, other supporters challenged the legality of segregation on buses in the Supreme Court case Browder v. Gale. The case was brought under the United States District Court by African Americans demanding a change because it questioned the constitutionality of the idea of separate but equal.
The Supreme Court outlawed the previous notion of separate but equal, determined by the Plessy v. Ferguson case. The Supreme Court decided that the segregation of African Americans on buses was unconstitutional. The reason of the sudden desire for equality was triggered by Rosa Parks.
A number of whites tried to end the boycott in every way possible, but failed. They started with trying to separate the black community, then they turned to violence, and finally they sought assistance in the law. A few African Americans were punished, including Dr. King, but they continued to avoid the buses.
After a long 381 days of boycotting, the Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal to segregate blacks and whites on public transportation. This was the first step towards acceptance of all races in the United States. Culturally, socially, economically, and politically, the United States was prospering. But under the facade of glory and success, African Americans suffered greatly.
They were not accepted under the superiority of white culture, especially in the southern part of the U.S. Although some steps were taken, such as in the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education, where the Supreme Court declared that separate educational facilities for black children were inherently unequal. Rosa Parks was the first leader to take a step towards full equality.
Socially, African Americans were considered to be the lowest class and were discriminated against by the white community.
The country's economy grew by 37% in the 1950s, but 25% of the citizens lived in poverty, many of whom were African Americans.
Although African Americans were given the opportunity to vote, they were frowned upon and did not hold major political positions in office. As the mother of the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks began a long journey on the road to equality for all races. Rosa Parks was a role model for all African Americans, and after the boycott, they were more persistent and firm about their beliefs about equality. The civil rights activists used peaceful protests and civil disobedience to generate change and gain rights that they deserved.
Although the federal government helped them by passing the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1968, African Americans were still discriminated against. It wasn't until civil rights leaders such as Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X demanded freedom and equality. Because of their persistent efforts, African Americans are now considered equal and have contributed a lot to American society. I mean, we have an African American president.
When Rosa Parks was asked what the American dream meant to her, she said,
Well, I think the American dream should to have a good life and to live well and to be a good citizen. I think it should apply to all of us, and that it is the land of the free and the home of the brave, and I believe it should be just that with all people who can think of themselves as human beings, and that they will enjoy the blessings of the freedom of this country.
Rosa Parks died on October 24, 2005, in Detroit, Michigan. She changed the lives of millions of African Americans. She was the mother of the civil rights movement and left her gifts of hope, courage, and determination for all Americans to honor for centuries to come. I had no idea that history was being made. I was just tired of giving up.